Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Grit, Give, Recognize, Implement Time podcast. I'm your host, Steve Nathanson, CEO and founder of Strive for More, and I'm excited to keep this conversation going around strategy. We got into conveying a compelling vision for the future last week, and we addressed some very specific things on how to do that, essentially in a best case scenario. We didn't have anyone being really like tough and resistant and hell bent against not getting that implemented. So today, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that scenario. Let's talk about specifically, how do I handle people who are resistant, won't buy in to my vision? First and foremost, fundamentally as human beings, regardless if it's this scenario or others, we want to feel heard, truly listened to, not disregarded, right? We want to know someone has actually truly heard us. When we have resistance and people who aren't buying in, it's easier for us to kind of fall into, well, this is what's going to go. Why aren't you coming on board? Like, you need to get on board, versus actually truly listening and hearing them out. So that's part number one. Can we make them truly feel heard? Because the trick here is, even if ultimately they still don't agree and get on board with, you know what, I see the value in it, right? Maybe they're still, I don't like that we're going that way. Even if that's the case, when we truly do listen and hear them, it goes over so much better, because they've at least been able to express themselves, feel like that's been valued and listened to and considered. And that's always going to go over much better as if we disregard them. We just say no, we don't listen. Okay, so that's part of it. We have to give them that voice. That's a big part of this. Another part of giving them that voice is understanding their very specific concerns. And I know that sounds elementary. Like, yeah, we need to understand what they're concerned about. But when we do that, it allows us to have a much easier path to talk about what it is that's causing them heartache, why they're not getting on board, to address that, to speak to that, to educate. It's so much easier. Well, if we get past the anger of, this is terrible, it's not going to work, it's horrible, why are we doing this? Once we get past that and we get to the specific concerns they have, then we can actually address it, right? So we need to make them feel heard, give them that voice, understand the specifics of what's causing them to not be on board. And then we can have a successful conversation around it. So that's a little bit on some of the kind of how and the mechanics, if you will, of the actual conversation. Before we even get into that, let's talk about some of the logistics. So before the conversation, setup, right? The logistics of it, timing and setting, those are key. What I mean by that is one-on-one, group, virtual, in person, telephone, video conference. What is the setting? It's always best, in my opinion, to have these conversations where we get visual feedback. So in person, I say, is always going to be better than video conferencing, because there's a little bit more that we get input-wise from it. But if we can't do it in person, then video is the next best thing. Reason behind that, 60 to 65% of our communication is nonverbals. It's body language, facial expressions. To really have the successful kind of conversation we're talking about, it's important for us to get that feedback, and for them as well to get that feedback. So having that visual component to it is very important. And the timing is important as well. We may be a morning person, they may be as well. That would be a great time. But let's say, okay, we're both morning people, we're both more with it, we're both more upbeat, great time to have it. We don't want to catch them coming out of a meeting, maybe we know always upsets them, right? So there is a couple things to timing. When are they going to be kind of energetic and at the best possible self to have this conversation as freely and openly as possible? And what perhaps precursors do we know exist that we can avoid, not only for them, but also for us, right? We want to go into this with the right type of mentality, mindset, and openness to not only give ourselves the best chance to have the conversation, but also to give them the best chance to be open and receptive to it as well, particularly if this is something that's going to be angry, aggressive, and they may be up here to start so that we can bring them back down to here. So timing and setting are key. Another thing about the logistics is we don't want to rush this conversation. So a lot of times we look for closure, instant results. We want to have this conversation soon as possible when something's bugging us. This is no different. When we force and we rush having that conversation and we just continually cram it down the throat, we need to talk, we need to talk, we need to talk. If they're not ready yet, they're not going to be open and receptive. So we need to have this element of, are we rushing and forcing that conversation? When we give them the space and time to kind of process and go through what they need to naturally go through, and then hit them when they're done with that, that is the best possible time because they're going to be more open, more receptive. We're going to eliminate some of the things we may get really early on of those reactions of, why are we doing this? This is terrible. I don't understand. Like you don't know what you're doing, right? All that anger, that aggression, those initial reactions. We can wait that out, right? That is possible. So that's another element of having this conversation and dealing with people who are resistant, is the timing of it. The other elements, perhaps, that are in play are, we as leaders have a line to walk. Company employee, let's call that the line. We want to be sympathetic, empathetic, while holding true to the new changes and what the company is doing. Right? That's a fine line for a lot of people to walk, and it's an important line for people to walk. Worked with a number of leaders like, I understand, I feel the same way that they do, but I can't openly come out and say that. There is a line I have to hold true to because I also see the value in where we're going, and I need to be able to convey that, right? That is part of my role as a leader, is to help guide them into that new direction. Okay, there's validity to that. Within this is not a knock on individual contributors at all. It's just a mere fact that typically has different perceptions around what we consider important. Typically, individual contributors are very focused on their circle of concern, which is what is they're asked to do, their tasks, their jobs, their projects. Typically, they don't see beyond that, right? Again, it's not a knock. It's just a difference of perspective and purview around what's important for them, their circle of concern. As leaders, we grow outwards and upwards to be higher level, to be more strategic, and we get exposed to greater things in the business from the standpoint of what's going on elsewhere. That's what I mean by greater and higher. With that, it's not just the team that we're concerned about. It may be a whole business unit. It may be several teams. It may be an entire organization if we're the CEO or C-suite. So with that in mind, there may be things that make sense holistically for the business and are things that are good for the business that impact an individual contributor who doesn't agree with it, but may not actually have the insight and understanding because they're not at this level to know the benefit, because it's also outside of their level of concern, their circle concern. So that's an important role in this, and it can impact how to have this conversation as well. What education do we provide? How do we help them see that? How do we open them up just beyond their circle of concern? We can speak to that. Again, it's not a knock by any means. It's just typically as we advance that career, that perspective, that circle of concern shifts and grow. And a lot of people, right, who step into management for the first time, it's really eye-opening. How much that manager actually deals with, how much they learn, how much they see, and their level of concern and circle concern grow. So having that part of the conversation can be very beneficial depending on the person that you're talking to, and maybe what are those specific concerns that they brought out. Like we said, get to the heart of that, and then it's easier to address. Within all of this, we did mention time. Time can be an element to help smooth over, but fundamentally, if we have a conversation like this with somebody, it's easier for them to get on board, even if ultimately say, you know what, I don't agree with it, but I appreciate you. Thank you for hearing me. I'm in a much better place. Ultimately, that's a really good scenario to actually have as an outcome, because we may not get people on board. That's okay. We may get them on board. Like, hey, you know what? Actually, that makes a lot of sense. You know what? Thank you. Very appreciative. That really, yeah, okay. I could see that. I'm squared away. Thank you. Right. That's best case. Even if there's still hesitancy, we have a conversation like this. There's a level of respect. They feel heard. They can move forward and they can do their job. Let's address maybe kind of the other looming scenario where someone doesn't get on board, but they're not professional. They're aggressive. They may berate people. They're angry. That is something legitimately that can happen. So how do we deal with that type of resistance? There's a couple things. First and foremost, as a leader and a manager, you're still entitled to respectful conversation. You do not have to stand there and just get yelled at, no matter who you are. You don't have to have that be something you just take. You can set those professional expectations, those ground rules. There's a number of different ways that you can do that, right? You can do that kind of upfront by having a conversation with your team holistically. I know we've got some changes. I know there's a lot of feelings around it that may be on board, that may not be on board. More than happy to talk to you about it. If you want, find some one-on-one time to do it. Some ground rules for it are that I'll have that conversation very gladly if it's very respectful, right, professional, reasonable conversation. Because I know sometimes things can make us very angry and upset, and that's okay. But in that conversation, feel the best way to have that, right, is to be able to discuss that when we're both able to have the conversation very level-headedly. You can set that expectation. In the moment, too, if someone's just berating and yelling at you, you can do that in that moment, right? You can feel free to say, oh, John, I'm very happy to have this conversation. Really, truly am. But I do need to take that step back and ask that we do that in a way that's down here, that's calm, it's professional. If we need some time before we can do that, that's okay. Right? You can, in that moment, take that step. It's important when you do that to not escalate to their level, because that just does this and brings us higher. We have to stay down here because that's the best chance of getting them to come down here too. So I wanted to share that because this is a real world scenario that I have addressed with people about how do we deal with resistance, or quote unquote kind of negative Nancy's, if you will, who just won't buy in, who are angry, aggressive. You don't have to sit there and be yelled at. You have the absolute right to be able to have a calm and collected conversation with somebody, and to be able to walk away and have that conversation later when they are able to have that conversation with them. That is a level of professionalism expected in the workplace from everybody, not just you, not just your leader, not just your individual contributors, but everybody as a whole. And that is an absolute right of ours to ask for that. If someone continues to not do that, they continue to be aggressive, they continue to bring down the team, here's a couple other ways. One, that lets us know, if you look at this as a win-win, there's a deeper issue that needs to be addressed. And maybe that's an HR issue, maybe it's a PIP issue, whatever it happens to be, there could be something deeper that needs to be brought out and addressed that's going to dictate different actions as a leader to take. Another part of that is there performance issue or anything like that tied to it? Maybe they're just negative, they don't want to be here anymore, and it brings it down. And if that's the case and the team is being literally brought down by one person, what is an organization going to do to remove that person? It doesn't have to be firing, but this is something we don't do often enough. Find the right spot for that person, get them out of the team, and you'd be surprised how well that works and what that does and alleviates for that team to get up and running again. So that's a, say, kind of worst case scenario of this person is still being absolutely resistant, because there is an element of, what have I tried? As a leader, do I feel like I've tried everything that's reasonable and appropriate to try to help, and it's fallen short? Because there are always two people in the conversation, and we can do tricks and tips like we've talked about today to set ourselves up for success in helping that person. But until they're really ready to actually take action on it, we can't help. So this is kind of that worst case scenario when they are just completely resistant and they're not taking that step with you to be able to do for the best of the team. So let's kind of recap real quick. What are the ways to get people who are resistant to buy in? Fundamentally, make them feel heard, give them that voice, understand their specific concerns so we can talk about that, have a conversation with them. And in that conversation, choose the right timing, the right setting. Don't rush and force that conversation. Walk that fine line you feel is appropriate for you as a leader, for company employee, and provide the necessary education and talk about and understand their circle of concern versus a circle of concern for the entirety of the change. And then as needed, this last part we were talking about, set those ground rules to have that conversation successfully and put your best foot forward to do that before we have to trigger the other things that we have talked about that may come when someone is not at all coming along and easing their resistance. So I hope you enjoyed this. There's definitely more to come. So until the next time, be the movement in your life.